Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. This time it's on the Global Carbon Budget 2024. It's kind of like getting our planet's yearly checkup. Seeing where all the carbon dioxide is coming from and going.
Like a global carbon EKG.
Exactly. We've got our trusty guides here. The Global Carbon Budget 2024 report itself and its supplement. They're packed with all the details.
Like a map and a magnifying glass for the planet's carbon cycle.
So are you ready to get a little nerdy with us and delve into this carbon world?
Let's do it.
Okay, so jumping right in the report gives us a bit of a mixed bag on fossil fuel emissions. Those coming from oil, coal, and gas.
Right, the usual suspects.
They call these EFOs in the report, and, well, they're still rising this year. But there's a silver lining. The rate of that increase is slowing down.
Sure.
In fact, countries have actually managed to decrease their emissions over the last decade.
Yeah.
What do you think is driving that change?
That's a fantastic question, and something the report digs into. It seems like policy changes and technological advancements are playing a huge role. Picture the global energy system. It's been chugging along on coal for ages, but now we're seeing this shift towards cleaner sources like natural gas and renewables. That's having a real impact.
It's like we're swapping out the old gas guzzler for a fuel-efficient electric car, right?
Exactly. And the report goes even deeper with something called the Kaya decomposition. It helps us understand all the factors influencing these emissions changes.
Kaya decomposition.
Mm-hmm.
Now that sounds a little technical. Can you break it down for us?
Absolutely. Think of it like baking a cake. The final product, the emissions, depends on the ingredients and how much you use of each. The Kaya decomposition lets us analyze those ingredients, things like economic growth, how efficiently we use energy, and how much carbon our energy sources release. By looking at how these factors interact, we can see why emissions are changing.
So it's not just about cutting back on everything. It's about making smarter choices with how we produce and consume energy.
Precisely. Take the European Union, for example. They've really made an effort to ditch coal, especially in Germany. And as they've embraced renewables and become more energy efficient, their emissions have dropped. Now, the report also separates out emissions from international shipping and aviation because their post-pandemic rebound is making them a bit of an outlier.
Makes sense. They're in their own category. So we've got these fossil fuel emissions, and those are still a big problem. But the report also delves into another source, land use change emissions, or ELUC. This seems like a really complex piece of the puzzle.
It is ELUC captures all the ways humans impact the carbon stored in land-based ecosystems. Imagine a forest being cleared for agriculture or development. That releases carbon into the atmosphere. But it's not just deforestation. We've also got reforestation where trees are planted to absorb CO2, and then there's the degradation of peatlands, those massive carbon sinks that release emissions when drained or burned.
It's like we're juggling all these different factors trying to keep the carbon in balance.
Exactly. And the report highlights some regional differences in ELUC. For example, Southeast Asia saw a big drop in peat fire emissions this year thanks to the end of those El Niño conditions.
Those weather patterns that tend to bring dry spells, right?
Right. El Niño usually makes Southeast Asia drier, increasing the risk of peat fires, which release a lot of CO2. So its absence this year has helped reduce emissions from that source.
But then we have South America, where those ELUC emissions are actually increasing.
Yeah.
The report says it's due to more deforestation and fires linked to land degradation.
It's a reminder that progress isn't uniform and some regions are still grappling with these issues.
And this is where it gets tricky. The report emphasizes the uncertainty around ELUC estimates. Measuring these processes seems almost impossible.
It's incredibly complex. Imagine trying to track every tree cut down, every acre burned, and every sapling planted across the globe. It's a massive undertaking, and there are inherent uncertainties in the data and methods used to estimate these emissions.
So how do we make sense of all this when it comes to tackling climate change?
That's the crucial question. While the uncertainty highlights the need for more research and better monitoring, it doesn't diminish the urgency of addressing land use change. We need solutions that both reduce emissions and enhance carbon sequestration, protecting existing forests, promoting sustainable land management, and restoring degraded ecosystems. These actions not only mitigate climate change, but also provide benefits like biodiversity conservation and better livelihoods for local communities.
It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about protecting the ecosystems that support life on Earth. Okay, so we've been talking about the sources of CO2 emissions, all the ways we're contributing to the problem. But now let's shift to something a bit more hopeful, the sinks. These are the natural processes that absorb CO2 from the atmosphere like a planetary cleanup crew.
Exactly. Both land and ocean act as these giant carbon sinks, pulling in a significant portion of the CO2 we release. Think of them as Earth's built-in climate regulators.
And it seems the land is doing a pretty good job. The report mentions that its ability to remove human-caused CO2, those anthropogenic emissions, has been surprisingly consistent for decades, absorbing about 30% of what we emit.
It's a testament to the power of nature. Now, this land sink is driven by a few key processes. One is what we call CO2 fertilization. Essentially, as CO2 levels rise, plants have more fuel for photosynthesis. It's like giving them an extra boost, leading to faster growth and greater carbon uptake.
So it's a bit of a silver lining. Plants are benefiting from our excess CO2, at least for now.
To some extent, yes. But it's not that simple. We also have to consider the impacts of climate change itself on the land sink.
Right, because things like those increased wildfires and droughts we talked about can release carbon back into the atmosphere, potentially weakening that land sink over time.
Precisely. It's a delicate balance, and we can't assume the land sink will always operate at its current capacity.
Now let's dive into that other carbon sink, the ocean. It's vast and mysterious, playing a crucial role in regulating the Earth's carbon cycle.
Imagine the ocean as a giant sponge soaking up CO2 from the atmosphere. That absorbed carbon is then transported to the deep ocean through a process called the biological pump, where marine organisms take up carbon during photosynthesis and eventually sink to the bottom when they die.
That's fascinating. But how do scientists actually measure this massive ocean sink? It seems like a huge challenge.
You're right, it's not easy. Scientists use a combination of direct measurements of CO2 in the ocean, taken from ships and buoys, and complex computer models that simulate ocean circulation and carbon cycling.
It's like having a network of underwater sensors constantly monitoring the ocean's carbon intake.
Exactly. But even with these sophisticated tools, there are still challenges in quantifying the ocean sink. For example, we have limited data from certain regions, especially the Southern Ocean, which is a major carbon sink.
Wait, the Southern Ocean data is limited. Why is that, and how big of a problem is it for our understanding?
That's a great question, and it highlights one of the challenges in studying the carbon cycle. The Southern Ocean is vast and remote, making it difficult and expensive to collect data there. The limited data makes it harder to accurately estimate how much CO2 the ocean is absorbing, which can impact our understanding of the overall carbon budget. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with some missing pieces. We can still get a general idea, but the finer details remain unclear.
I see. So it's a constant battle against the vastness and complexity of nature. And there's another layer of complexity, right? The report mentions this ongoing debate about how to account for those temperature differences near the ocean surface, which can significantly impact the estimates.
You're picking up on the nuances here. These temperature variations influence how much CO2 the ocean can hold. Warmer water holds less. Accurately accounting for these seemingly small differences is crucial for getting a precise picture of the ocean sink.
So it's like trying to fine-tune a delicate instrument. Even slight adjustments can make a big difference in the readings. All of this makes me wonder if we're still figuring out how these sinks work. How can we be confident in our projections about climate change?
That's a great question, and it leads us to another intriguing concept in the report, the carbon budget imbalance.
Oh, I remember you mentioning that earlier. Can you unpack that for us? What exactly is this imbalance and why should we care?
Think of it like this. You're meticulously tracking your expenses, but at the end of the month, there's money missing. That's the carbon budget imbalance we're not fully accounting for where all the CO2 is going. Essentially, it's the unexplained gap between what we emit and what's absorbed by the land and ocean. It suggests that our understanding of the carbon cycle isn't complete, that there's still pieces of the puzzle we haven't quite figured out.
So this missing carbon, this imbalance, does that mean our climate models are way off? Are we underestimating the problem?
It's not that our models are necessarily wrong, but it does point to gaps in our understanding. It's like having a blurry image. We can make out the general shapes, but the finer details are fuzzy. This imbalance could mean we're missing some smaller carbon fluxes, those movements of carbon, between different parts of the Earth's system. They might seem insignificant on their own, but they could add up. Or perhaps there are processes happening in the ocean or on land that we haven't fully accounted for.
So like maybe there are these secret carbon-absorbing ecosystems we haven't discovered yet, or maybe the ocean is taking in more than we realize.
It's possible. And that's why research into this imbalance is so important. It could help us refine our models, improve our projections, and ultimately guide more effective climate action.
So while it's a bit unsettling to know we don't have all the answers, it also highlights how much there still is to discover about our planet.
Exactly, and that's what makes this field so fascinating. Okay, but let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the overall trends in emissions, those sources and sinks, but what about the human side of this equation? How are different countries contributing to the problem?
Right, because it's not like every country is emitting the same amount of CO2. What's the global picture looking like?
It's a mixed bag, and the report breaks down the trends by country, which is really insightful. While global emissions from fossil fuels are still climbing, it's not a uniform rise. Some countries are making significant strides in reducing their emissions, while others are lagging behind.
I was particularly struck by the fact that countries have managed to significantly reduce their fossil CO2 emissions over the past decade. It feels like a beacon of hope amidst all the grim news. What's their secret? Are there any common threads in their success stories?
It's interesting, isn't it? And it's not just a coincidence. Many of these countries have made deliberate policy choices and investments that have led to these reductions. For example, several of them have implemented carbon pricing mechanisms, essentially putting a price tag on carbon emissions, which incentivizes businesses and industries to reduce their footprint.
So it's like making polluting more expensive, which encourages cleaner alternatives.
Exactly. And many of these successful countries have also invested heavily in renewable energy sources like wind and solar. They've recognized that a transition to a clean energy economy is not just good for the environment, but also makes economic sense in the long run.
It's like they're playing a long game, investing now to avoid bigger problems down the road. But what about those countries where emissions are still rising? What's driving that trend?
Well, it's often a combination of factors. Some countries are still heavily reliant on fossil fuels for energy, and their economies may be growing rapidly, leading to increased energy demand. In some cases, there might be a lack of political will or financial resources to invest in cleaner alternatives.
So it's not just about pointing fingers. It's about understanding the complex interplay of economic development, energy needs, and political reality.
You got it. And the report actually uses that Kaya decomposition we talked about earlier to analyze those drivers of emissions growth in specific countries. It's like a diagnostic tool helping us pinpoint what's fueling the emissions fire in each case.
So if a country's emissions are mainly driven by, say, a growing manufacturing sector, they might focus on improving energy efficiency in those industries or switching to cleaner energy sources.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or if deforestation is a major contributor, the focus might shift towards policies that promote sustainable land management and protect forests.
It's like tailoring the solution to the specific problem rather than trying to apply a one-size-fits-all approach.
Precisely. And that's why understanding these national trends is so crucial. It allows us to move beyond generalizations and develop targeted strategies for reducing emissions.
Okay, so we've got this global patchwork of emissions trends, some encouraging, some concerning. But how does all of this fit into the bigger picture, that whole carbon budget concept we've been talking about? What are the implications for our climate goals?
That's the million-dollar question. Remember, the carbon budget sets a limit on how much CO2 we can emit collectively if we want to keep global warming below a certain threshold, like 15 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which scientists say is crucial for avoiding the worst impacts of climate change.
Right, it's like our global carbon allowance, and we've been spending it pretty recklessly.
Unfortunately, that's an apt analogy.
Yeah.
And the longer we delay action, the faster we burn through that budget, making it even harder to meet our climate targets.
It's like we're borrowing from future generations, but without their consent.
That's a powerful way to put it.
Yeah.
It underscores the urgency of transitioning to a low-carbon economy. The report emphasizes the need to accelerate the phase-out of fossil fuels, rapidly scale up renewable energy deployment, and invest in carbon removal technologies.
So it's not just about slowing down the rate of emissions growth, it's about making a fundamental shift in how we produce and consume energy. But given that carbon budget imbalance we discussed earlier, how confident can we be in our ability to stay within those limits?
That's where things get even more complex. That missing carbon, that uncertainty in our understanding of the carbon cycle adds another layer of risk. It means we might be underestimating how much CO2 we can safely emit before hitting those critical temperature thresholds.
So it's like we're navigating uncharted territory with a map that's missing some crucial details.
Exactly. And that's why a precautionary approach is essential. We need to err on the side of caution, aim for more ambitious emissions reductions, and invest in research to improve our understanding of the carbon cycle. We can't just assume that things will work out in our favor. We need to act decisively, even in the face of uncertainty.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty sobering picture so far: rising emissions, a shrinking carbon budget, and a lot of unknowns. What's the good news? Where do we even begin with something as massive as global carbon emissions?
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming, but the report offers some hope. It highlights a bunch of solutions across different sectors. It's not about one magic fix. It's about a multi-pronged approach, tackling it from all sides.
So a bit of everything, but done strategically.
Exactly. Let's start with energy. It's the biggest culprit for emissions. And the good news is that renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal, they're getting better and cheaper all the time.
Mm.
Imagine most of our electricity coming from these clean sources. That's the future we need. And it's not just about switching to renewables. We need to use energy more efficiently, too. Think about it. If we use less energy, we automatically lower emissions no matter the source.
So things like making our homes more energy efficient, taking public transport, driving electric cars, being more mindful about our energy use.
Exactly. Every little bit counts. But individual action isn't enough. We need strong policies to push this transition forward. Carbon pricing, renewable energy subsidies, regulations on emissions. Those are key to creating a level playing field and speeding up the shift to a low-carbon economy.
Setting the rules to favor the clean players.
Precisely. We need governments to step up and make it worthwhile for businesses to invest in clean tech and practices.
Okay, so energy is a big piece. But what about land use change, that other major emissions source?
Right. Remember those natural carbon sinks like forests and peatlands? Protecting and restoring them is huge. Trees are amazing at absorbing carbon. So halting deforestation and planting more trees can make a big difference. It's like using nature's own carbon capture system.
Working with nature, not against it. I like that. But what about the emissions we can't avoid? Those industries that are really hard to decarbonize.
That's where carbon removal technologies come in. They can grab CO2 straight from the atmosphere or industrial sources and store it safely underground. It's like cleaning up the mess we've already made.
Sounds futuristic, but the report seems optimistic about it.
There are challenges for sure. It's not a cure-all. But carbon removal is advancing fast and could be a big help in reaching our climate goals.
So we've got clean energy, sustainable land, use carbon removal. That's a pretty good toolkit. But even with all that, the biggest challenge seems to be getting everyone on board. This is a global issue that needs global action.
Absolutely. We need international agreements and collaborations to set ambitious targets, share knowledge, and help developing countries transition to a low-carbon future. It's a team effort for sure.
Like a giant puzzle we all need to solve together. But it's not just about governments and companies. Individuals have a role too, right? What can we do in our own lives?
Definitely. We can make better choices about what we buy and how we live, using less plastic, choosing energy-efficient appliances, eating less meat, supporting sustainable businesses, and advocating for climate action.
Making everyday choices count, knowing they're part of something bigger.
Exactly. Every action, every decision can make a difference.
You know, after diving into this report, it feels like we're at a crossroads. We have the knowledge, the tech, the solutions.
Yeah.
But it comes down to our will to act. What are your thoughts on that?
Couldn't agree more. We're not lacking options. We're lacking urgency, political will, and sometimes hope. We need to change the narrative, move past the doom and gloom, and embrace the possibilities.
We're not just passengers. We're the ones driving, and we can choose a better direction.
That's what I hope listeners take away from this deep dive. The Global Carbon Budget 2024 isn't just numbers and graphs. It's a wake-up call, a reminder that we hold the planet's future in our hands.
Thanks for guiding us through this carbon cycle adventure, highlighting the challenges and the opportunities. It's been insightful.
My pleasure. It's been great to explore these complex issues with you.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something, felt inspired, and maybe even found a bit of hope amidst the climate challenge. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those conversations going.